In the Fed, we trust. Hi, I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist. Well, we're looking today at money supply. I have something called the macro model that I've used in my books, and I use it in the classroom on a continual basis. I claim that I can explain all of macroeconomics in 2 minutes, and I'll do it for even faster than that for you today. The economy goes two ways. It goes up and down. There are two entities that can act on the economy. The government with fiscal policy, they have two tools, taxing and spending. The Federal Reserve Bank has two tools, interest rates and money supply. That's it. That's macroeconomics. There are four levers that can be thrown, turned, adjusted to affect the economy. In fiscal policy, I've talked about taxes in podcast number 19. I've talked about spending in number 30, some in number 8. I have one called Economic Humanism, which is number 21. But let me go back to my outline here. Fiscal, the government has two levers, taxing and spending. I've talked to you about those in other podcasts. The Federal Reserve Bank has two levers, interest rates and money supply. Today I'm talking about the second one in order there, called money supply. And when you get down to it, interest rates and money supply are the same thing, but that's more than I want to get into today. Money supply. In the Fed, we trust. Why do we trust in the Fed? See, as Christian economists, this hits at the nexus of where we live. What do we trust? Do we trust God or do we trust the economy? See, it should be a simple question, shouldn't it? But as we go about our lives, we find that we're trusting more in the government. And my attention is drawn to that today from a July 24 article in the Wall Street Journal by this brilliant guy named Ruchir Sharma. And his first book was in 2012 when I read it in 2012 when it came out. Yeah, the book was called Breakout Nations. At the time, I was really interested in the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and during successive spring and fall breaks, I had taken MBA students from Dallas Baptist University to these four countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. His book develops it even further. He covers 10 countries and does it much more effectively than I can do. Ruchir Sharma, really, really a smart guy. So I read his book way back in 2012 and found that I really respect this guy. So now on July 24th, 2020, here he comes out in the Wall Street Journal with an article titled, "The Rescues Ruining Capitalism." And you know what? He's correct. The subtitle is, "Easy Money and Constant Stimulus Have Undermined the Basic Dynamics of the Free Market. We've paid the price in low growth and productivity, falling entrepreneurship, and rising inequality." While he spends much of the article talking about both fiscal and monetary policy, I'm trying to concentrate today on the monetary policy part done by the Federal Reserve Bank, specifically money supply. You know, Sergei Seidamatov and I have a book coming out later this year called Biblical Economic Policy, and the brilliant graphics guys at our publisher Deep River Books have taken a dollar and folded it into a cross representing the cross of Christ. And right across the horizontal, they folded it so uniquely so that the words on the back of the dollar are going across the cross. And what are the words? In God we trust. Isn't that fascinating? So what do we trust? Mr. Sharma here is making the very good point that we have gained too much trust in not only fiscal policies, but monetary policies. And again, Mr. Sharma is writing from a very secular point of view. My job as a Christian economist is to interpret this for us through the lens of the Christian worldview, and that's what I want to do today. Let's look at his article here. So he says, modern society looks increasingly to government for protection from major crises. Yeah, boy, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a theologian, but I'd like to be today. I just don't have the time to do it with you, nor the capacity. Why do we rely on others for safety? Why do we point to the government so often to take care of us? That is not in the Christian worldview, you know. We're supposed to rely on God and His church to take care of us. We're not supposed to rely on the Federal Reserve Bank, but we've done so, and that's what Mr. Sharma is saying. Back to his article here. He says, there is a downside to this reflex to intervene. Our growing intolerance for economic risk and loss is undermining the natural resilience of capitalism and now threatens its very survival. He is correct. It does threaten the survival of capitalism because capitalism is about free markets. We often call it free market capitalism. It's becoming less so all the time. It is less free because the government is intervening too much. Back to Mr. Sharma here. He says the Federal Reserve is printing massive amounts of new money and directly buying the debt of troubled companies for the first time, end quote. This really is, most of us would consider a violation of the Federal Reserve Bank's charter. Okay, there are people who know more about the Fed than me. But it seems to me that they do not have the charter to buy individual stocks of companies, but they have begun to do so. So either I misunderstand it or they're violating their charter. In any case, they've gone way beyond their original intent in doing so. Let me back up just a little bit and give you the overview here. Let's take a 30,000-foot view. I said this in one of my podcasts recently. I think it was number 26, titled The Economic Recovery. So if we're in an elevator and somebody says, well, Dave, what's going to happen to the economy because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the government response? I would have two answers. Number one, increasing spending will eventually raise taxes. That's the fiscal part. Two, the monetary part, increasing money supply will cause a decrease in the value of the dollar. That's the elevator speech. You get off the elevator, that's it. Which one am I talking about today? That second part, which means a monetary policy of increasing the supply of money will eventually mean each dollar will be worth less. Look, this is just economics. You can't get out of this, right? Here's one thing I'm still reading from Mr. Sharma down here. Government officials believe this will carry no cost or consequences. It will, and Mr. Sharma is correct. Look, one of my favorite techniques in the classroom is to walk across the front of the classroom and say, students, do you remember when you were in the 8th grade and you were taking physical science, and your physical science teacher walked across the front of the classroom like this, and she said, I'm pushing the earth backwards. Okay, maybe she only weighed 120 pounds. She wasn't pushing it very much, but that's what we study in economics. Which way is the push? Everything has an effect. So as you increase the amount of dollars, will each one become worth more or less? Come on, this is too simple. We're walking in a certain direction. The Fed is walking across the front of your classroom. They're increasing the supply of money. Which way does that push the value? Well, it pushes it lower. And that's what Mr. Sharma is saying, and he's exactly right. Back to his article. He's saying the rising culture of government dependence is in fact a form of socialism. And he's exactly right. It is a form of socialism. The group is making decisions instead of individuals making decisions. He says easy money fuels the rise of giant firms and even zombie firms. Okay, this is more finance than I want to get into. But a zombie firm is defined by the Bank for International Settlements as a firm who can't even earn enough profit to pay the debt on their loans. This is amazing. Zombie firms. And there are many of these. Why? Because money is so cheap and money is so relatively available. Because not only the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, but others have lowered their interest. Look, going into the pandemic, there were 3 central banks who had negative rates. The European Central Bank, Switzerland Central Bank, and Japan Central Bank. Just before the pandemic, the European Central Bank had lowered their prime interest rate from negative 0.4 to negative 0.6. More than I want to get into today. Let's see if we can get back to what is the pain of this? What is our Christian worldview of these negative interest rates and of easy money? Back to Mr. Sharma. He says growing government involvement in the economy typically leads to lower productivity and weaker growth. That's right. He's exactly right. And productivity is really important. My podcast number 27 is titled Policies That Promote Production. And I maintain this is all that separates rich from poor countries. If you have policies that encourage people to produce, they will. If you have policies that discourage them from producing, they will not produce. It's as simple as that. And what Mr. Sharma is making the point here is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, the government, not only in the U.S., but other governments, via their central banks, ours is the Federal Reserve Bank, are causing people to be less productive because they are rewarding non-productivity. Yeah, it's as simple as that. Yeah. Reading from him again, Mr. Sharma. The idea of government as the balm for all crises is appealing in the short term, but it ignores the unintended consequences. Without entrepreneurial risk and creative destruction, capitalism doesn't work, says Mr. Sharma, and he's correct. And I point you back to my podcast number 28. Companies can't be saved. That's what he's talking about. The federal government, via fiscal policy, and the Federal Reserve Bank, via monetary policy, is not saving companies. They're saving the managers of those companies. This is a very short-term thinking. Yeah. Oh, back to productivity. Mr. Sharma says, over the last 20 years, the falling default rate among companies has also closely mirrored the slowdown in U.S. productivity, which is not surprising, end quote. Yeah. Policies that promote production are what make countries rich. The greater policies you have that promote it, the richer your country will get. This is just too easy. And the question of whether the Fed even has the authorization to buy stock in these companies, Mr. Sharma doesn't approach that. So again, there are people who know more about the Fed than I do, and maybe I'm missing something here, but it seems to me that they've gone too far past their original idea, which was to control the money supply. And if you look at conservative economists like Milton Friedman, of those four things I talked about, fiscal has two, right? Taxing and spending. Fed has two, interest rates and money supply. I'm pretty much on the Milton Friedman side saying of those four, one should control the economy. That is, money supply should match growth so that money is real. In Biblical Economic Policy by Dave Arnott and Sergei Seidamatov, we say what is happening now is violating one of our 10 commandments of economics, which is honest measures. So the value of the dollar eventually will fall because there's just too many of them. They've printed too many, yeah. And so Mr. Sharma is asking the question here. The question is, how much further capitalism will be deformed by government intervention on the scale of which we're seeing now? Because the Fed has bought stock in Apple, Walmart, AT&T, Disney, Nike, and Berkshire Hathaway. Well, this is not creeping socialism. This is galloping socialism. So in who do we trust? That's my question today. Right? Yeah. One more quote from Mr. Sharma and we'll be done here. He says, after 2008, the Federal Reserve Bank and the Treasury were praised to the moon for, quote, saving the world, end quote. But the Federal Reserve Bank's experimental forays into quantitative easing continued long after the crisis was over. Quantitative easing is another phrase they use in economics discipline to mean increasing money supply. It's just they do it in a number of different ways, right? But it's not working. And in the long term, it will defeat capitalism, or, as Mr. Shamar says in this very good article on July 24th in the Wall Street Journal, the rescue's ruining capitalism. In who do we trust? My question today, in economics, it looks like in the Fed we trust. But if you look at the back of your dollar, or the front of the upcoming book, Biblical Economic Policy by Dave Arnott and Sergei Seidamatov, you'll see that on the back of the dollar it says, in God we trust. I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist, where our slogan is, fear God, tell the truth, earn a profit. See you next time.